Hi folks, Tony Curtin here from Engage Learning and Development, and welcome to our third video in our cognitive load series. And here we're going to talk about or be answering the question, what is the worked example principle? So the worked example principle is one of the principles within the field of cognitive load theory that has a really solid evidence base. And if you'd watched our previous two videos, particularly the one around different types of cognitive load, this principle has been shown to enhance what we call germane load, germane cognitive load. And in a nutshell, I'd encourage you to go and watch that video if you haven't, but in a nutshell, germane load relates to the amount of working memory resources that a student or a person needs to expend to establish long-term memories, to establish mental schema or mental models. And the worked example principle has been shown to be really effective in enhancing germane load and ultimately making things much easier from a cognitive perspective for our learners. So it's a really important instructional design technique. One of the first things we should talk about is, well, what is a worked example? A worked example is a finished product of whatever it is that you're teaching. It could be a document, maybe a project plan, maybe an assessment tool. It could be a product itself. Maybe it's a cake or a particular dish that you're training in a hospitality course, whatever it might be. So the worked example is a finished product of something. Hopefully you've seen this before in courses that you've been to. The idea behind the worked example principle is there's several things, but number one, it's to give the learner an example of what we're working towards. But there's other things as well. There's other value that we can extract from worked examples. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of those here. So in a nutshell, the worked example principle states that we learn better when we're provided with worked examples somewhere near the beginning of our learning journey. And to give you an example of this, one I'm going to use here is a classic unit of competency or subject within the Australian vocational education and training sector, where probably most of you are working. And this particular subject has had a lot of uptake. A lot of people have had to complete this subject in recent years in Australia. A lot of trainers have had to complete it. And it's one, having delivered it, have assessed it, and even having designed tools for this, it's one that many learners struggle with. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but the primary one, I think, is because of the inherent complexity within the task itself. And if you watched our previous videos on cognitive load theory, within CLT, within cognitive load theory, we define complexity as the extent to which a subject has high element interactivity. And so whether there's a lot going on in a particular subject. And so in this particular subject, there's a lot going on. There's a lot that the person has to keep in mind when designing an assessment tool. And here's some of that stuff, right? It's a busy slide because it is a busy subject. So you've got all sorts of things, how to write good assessment instructions, the unit of competency itself, how to write questions, checklists, third-party reports. What are they? When can I use them? How to map an assessment tool back to a unit of competency, rules of evidence, principles of assessment. And much of this, the student needs to keep in mind as they're going about designing their assessment tool. And so this task is inherently complex. On top of that, many students don't have a good working model around, a mental model around designing assessment tools. So they're often at what we would call novice level. And so this is a classic example of where a worked example would be beneficial. So there's several points here that I want to make about worked examples. Firstly, they're primarily useful in complex subjects, as I mentioned, with high element interactivity. and specifically where methods and processes must be applied. So, and the design and develop assessment tools subject is definitely one of those. There are methods and processes, and as we talked about, there is really high element of interactivity. I've got to keep in mind a bunch of things as I'm designing this tool, which is difficult for a novice to do. The second thing I'd say is worked examples can be really useful if we're using them from a scaled perspective. So using them as a learning, what we call a generative learning activity. And what I mean by that is when we're using scaled examples, that is, this one's a really good example, this one's not so good, this one's somewhere in between, we can get learners to do things like identify errors, what worked well, what isn't working well in this example, what processes are working well, what processes or rules have been adhered to or maybe breached in this example, and getting the learner to explain why or why not the particular example is effective and ultimately what's working and what isn't. Now, this is a classic generative activity, and getting the learner so we've explained some stuff to them and then getting them to apply that theory to an already developed example. So when you've got something that's high in complexity, high in element interactivity, it involves methods, processes, rules, principles, the worked example principle is a great one to adhere to. So develop some worked examples and get your learners to work through them. So there you have it, the worked example principle. Hope you go and play with that. In the very next video, we're going to be talking about one that's linked to this, or one that can really help us here with complex tasks, and that is the segmenting principle. So I hope to see you in the next video. If you found this useful, give us a big like, add a comment if you want to say something, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm Tony Curtin, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.